In 1993, in the sun-drenched suburbs of South Florida, a relationship between two best friends turned volatile, and only one would survive. It was a story of domination, jealousy, and manipulation that ended with 7 teenagers conspiring to end the life of one of their own. Bobby Kent and Marty Puccio had grown up together in Hollywood, Florida. They lived just a few streets apart, went to the same schools, and had been inseparable since childhood. Bobby was described as charismatic and confident, but also as possessing a controlling and often abrasive personality. He was the kind of friend who seemed to direct everyone around him. Marty was the opposite, quiet, loyal, and eager to please. To outsiders, their friendship looked unbreakable. But beneath its surface was a more complex dynamic, a relationship reportedly built on fear. By high school, Bobby's dominance had escalated into a pattern of mistreatment. He allegedly humiliated Marty constantly, mocking his clothes, making threats, and even subjecting him to physical altercations in public. Friends stated that Bobby treated Marty like property, and yet Marty remained in the friendship. Whether this was due to loyalty, fear, or a more complicated psychological attachment, he never walked away. What does this type of dynamic reveal about the nature of long-term friendships that are founded on an imbalance of power? Before we analyze the suspicions in the case, please let me know where you saw this video. I will read it all and spread it around the world. And don't forget to like and subscribe to my channel to be the first to receive notifications when there are new videos. Things changed when Marty met Lisa Connolly, a 9-year-old with a sharp and independent personality. She reportedly saw through Bobby's control and strongly disapproved of how he treated Marty. At first, she tried to pull her boyfriend away, telling him he didn't need Bobby anymore. But Bobby's influence was powerful. He kept showing up, calling, and asserting control. Lisa began to see him not just as a negative influence, but as a potential danger. Soon, their small circle of friends, a mix of teens drifting between jobs, parties, and various troubles, began to share stories about Bobby's behavior. They claimed he threatened people, blackmailed girls, and bragged about being violent. A shared resentment toward him began to build within the group. Slowly, that resentment turned into planning. It started as a fantasy, with talk about teaching Bobby a lesson. But with each conversation, the line between revenge and a fatal outcome blurred. Lisa's cousin, Derek Zerko, joined the discussions, as did Ali Willis, Heather Swallers, Donald Seck, and Derek Kaufman, a local who claimed to have connections to organized crime. It became a circle of anger, feeding itself, with no one stepping in to de-escalate the situation or recognize how serious the planning had become. By July 1993, the plan was set. They decided to lure Bobby to a remote canal near Weston under the pretense of hanging out. The ruse worked. On the night of July 14, Bobby met up with his so-called friends, laughing and joking, apparently unaware that every person around him was part of a conspiracy against him. At first, everything seemed normal. They drank, talked, and waited for the right moment. Then, in an instant, the situation escalated. Donald Seck initiated the attack, inflicting a severe injury with a sharp object. Marty then joined in, contributing to multiple, serious wounds, while the others reportedly watched or participated. Testimony indicated he was also struck with a baseball bat and held down. When it was over, Bobby Kent, once the self-proclaimed leader of their world, was left by the canal as his remains sank into the mud. The group fled, leaving him there in the dark Florida night. Investigators later described it as one of the most severe cases they had ever seen, noting the extensive nature of the injuries. But the conspiracy did not hold for long. Within days, the truth unraveled. One of the teens broke down and confessed to her mother, who immediately went to the police. Investigators quickly pieced together the story. A premeditated ambush fueled by resentment and a desire to escape perceived control. The suburban incident became national news, shattering the illusion of safe, middle-class adolescents. These weren't hardened criminals. They were ordinary teenagers who had convinced themselves that a fatal act was their only way out. At trial, each played a different role. Marty Puccio, the best friend turned participant, faced first-degree murder charges. Lisa Connolly, the girlfriend who had helped plan the attack, was charged as an accessory. Derek Kaufman, who claimed mob ties, was accused of orchestrating it. One by one, the verdicts came in. Marty Puccio initially received the death penalty, which was later reduced to life in prison. Lisa Connolly was sentenced to 22 years. Derek Kaufman received a life sentence. The others received shorter sentences for their lesser roles, but none escaped the weight of their actions. In court, prosecutors described it as a murder of convenience, an execution of a bully by his victims. The defense argued that Bobby's long-term mistreatment had pushed them to the edge, that years of manipulation had finally exploded into violence. But the jury did not see it as an act of justified retaliation. They saw it as murder. Decades on, the case still sparks debate. Was it revenge or survival? Were they victims of cruelty or individuals looking for an excuse? There are no simple answers. Today, Marty Puccio remains in prison, serving life without parole. Lisa Connolly was released in 2004. The others have quietly disappeared from public life. For Bobby's family, the pain never faded. His father once said, "People talk about what kind of person he was, but no one deserves what they did to him." When a group of individuals, all subjected to one person's sustained psychological and physical torment, collectively decide on a fatal resolution, where does the boundary between victimhood and culpability lie? In September 2006, in the small town of Pocatello, Idaho, one 6-year-old Cassie Jo Stoddart agreed to house-sit for her aunt and uncle while they were away. It was supposed to be an easy weekend, a little independence, a quiet house, and a few extra dollars. Instead, it became one of the most disturbing cases of its kind in American history. A crime reportedly inspired by a movie, recorded like a script, and carried out by two of her friends. Cassie was responsible, smart, and artistic. She drew, loved music, and dreamed of studying law. Her teachers called her reliable. Her friends called her loyal. She wasn't the kind of girl who took risks, which is why her family trusted her to stay in the house alone. That Friday night, September 22, she invited her boyfriend, Matt Beckham, to keep her company. The two watched TV, fed the family pets, and relaxed. Later, two of their classmates, Brian Draper and Tori Adamsick, showed up, saying they wanted to hang out and watch a movie. Cassie knew them well. They were a little odd, quiet, but seemed friendly. She had no idea they were already documenting their plan to end her life. Before we analyze the suspicions in the case, please let me know where you saw this video. I will read it all and spread it around the world. Brian and Tori were both 16, intelligent, but held a deep fascination with themes of death and control. They reportedly spent hours watching horror movies, trading dark jokes, and filming themselves talking about committing violent acts. Their fixation was not necessarily with the act itself, but with the fame they believed came after it. They wanted to be remembered. In the weeks leading up to Cassie's death, they filmed a series of practice tapes. In one, Brian looked directly at the camera and said, "We're going to make history." Tori replied, "We're like the next Scream Killers." That night at the house, the four teens watched Kill Bill, Volume 2, and chatted about school. Cassie sat on the couch, joking and laughing, completely unaware that two of her guests were studying the layout of the home, the doors, the lights, the basement. Around 10:30 p.m., Brian and Tori said they were leaving for another party. Cassie and Matt stayed behind, saying goodnight at the door. But the boys didn't go far. They slipped outside, changed into dark clothes, masks, and gloves, and hid in the basement. Tori carried two bladed weapons, while Brian held a video camera. Their plan was simple: wait for Matt to leave, then attack Cassie while she was alone. A few minutes later, the power went out. Cassie and Matt thought it was a fuse and checked the basement door, but didn't go down. When the lights came back on, the house felt heavy, as if someone was watching. Matt's mother called soon after, telling him to come home. Cassie, ever responsible, insisted she'd be fine. She locked the doors and turned on the lights again. She didn't know the others were still inside. After Matt left, Brian and Tori waited a few minutes, then cut the power again. The house went black. Cassie called out, thinking maybe Matt had come back to scare her. Then she heard footsteps. She turned toward the sound and saw two masked figures rushing toward her. What happened next lasted only minutes. When it was over, the house was silent again. The next day, Cassie's relatives came home to a devastating scene. They found her in the living room, with evidence of a severe attack visible. The scene was cold and still. There was no sign of forced entry, no robbery, no break-in. The only mystery was why. Detectives questioned everyone close to her, including Matt, who told them about Brian and Tori's visit. Police brought the two boys in for interviews. They were nervous but calm, claiming they'd left early and hadn't seen anything unusual. Then, detectives discovered something in Tori's car, a stack of videotapes. On them was the truth. The recordings showed Brian and Tori planning the events before they happened, describing what they were going to do and how. One of them stated, "For all you FBI agents watching this, you weren't quick enough, and you weren't smart enough." After the incident, they filmed themselves again, laughing, swearing, and boasting. The video became the heart of the prosecution's case. It wasn't speculation or rumor. It was evidence straight from their own mouths. The individuals responsible had documented their fantasy and their pride. In court, the footage played for the jury, their voices echoing through the room. Cassie's family sat frozen as the boys described how they planned to make her their first kill. Prosecutors argued this was proof that this wasn't a crime of passion, but a performance. The boys had turned a real-life tragedy into a scene from a movie. Both were convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole. The judge said, "You wanted to be remembered, and now you will be, for all the wrong reasons." Their appeals argued that life without parole was too harsh for teenagers, but each one failed. Neither has reportedly shown genuine remorse. For Cassie's family, the pain never faded. Her mother said, "They filmed her death like entertainment. There's no forgiveness for that." Over the years, the case became known as the Scream Murder, a phrase that still chills everyone who hears it. It blurred the line between fiction and reality, between imitation and intent. The two individuals did not act out of revenge or jealousy. They acted because they wanted to know what it felt like to be the villains they watched on screen. And when their performance was over and the laughter stopped, all that was left was silence and a tape that would follow them forever. When the motive for a crime is not rooted in passion, revenge, or personal gain, but in the desire to imitate and document a fictional narrative for an imaginary audience, how do we begin to address a type of violence that treats human life as a prop in a performance? In February 2023, in Warrington, England, 6-year-old Brianna Ghey left home to meet two friends at a nearby park. By evening, she was deceased, having sustained numerous severe injuries in a premeditated attack planned entirely over social media. This was an incident that stunned the country, not just for the severity of the act, but for who was responsible. Two teenagers who had appeared friendly in her presence and messages, but had secretly planned the event. Brianna was bright, outspoken, and creative. She loved fashion, music, and TikTok, where her confident personality made her instantly recognizable. She had recently come out as transgender and was thriving socially funny, confident, and admired by friends for being authentically herself. But in the months leading up to the event, something changed. She had started spending time with two classmates, Scarlett Jenkinson and Eddie Ratcliffe, names later released after their sentencing. On the surface, they were quiet and polite, the kind of teenagers parents might not think twice about. Beneath that exterior, they shared a secret fixation on dark themes, including violence, and with each other. Their digital footprints told the story. Hundreds of messages exchanged over weeks revealed a growing preoccupation with these subjects. They discussed the concept of taking a life for the experience. This raises a critical question about the digital age. How do isolated online echo chambers amplify and validate disturbing fantasies? Before we analyze the suspicions in the case, please let me know where you saw this video. I will read it all and spread it around the world. It was fantasy at first, a kind of dark roleplay, but soon they began naming real people. Among them was Brianna. On the 11th of February 2023, they invited her to meet them at Culcheth Linear Park. Brianna thought it was just a casual hangout. She was dressed for the weather, chatting on her phone, and in good spirits. The park was quiet that afternoon, with empty paths and grey skies, the kind of calm that can hide everything. When Brianna arrived, they walked and talked as usual. Then, without warning, the attack began. Both individuals were involved in inflicting the injuries, using a sharp implement. Witnesses later reported hearing screams, then silence. The pair left her at the scene and walked away, texting each other within minutes about what had just occurred. The call to emergency services came from a passerby who found her. Paramedics tried to provide aid, but the injuries were fatal. Brianna was pronounced dead at the scene. At first, police treated it as an isolated attack, a random act of violence. But within hours, digital forensics revealed something far darker. Messages on Snapchat and Discord between the two individuals showed detailed planning, how they would lure her, what weapon to use, and even what time of day would draw the fewest witnesses. In one specific text, Scarlett wrote, "It'll be quick. She won't even know it's coming." The arrests came the next day. Both suspects, just 15 at the time, were brought in separately. Even seasoned detectives described the interviews as deeply unsettling. The pair reportedly showed no remorse, no panic, only curiosity about what would happen next. During the trial, prosecutors presented evidence of weeks of preparation. Scarlett had kept a handwritten document titled "Murder Plan" with notes about weapons and disposal. Eddie had saved violent videos and text threads discussing the act. They described the event as their shared project. In court, they sat side by side, calm, almost detached, while Brianna's family listened to every detail. Her mother, Ghey, sat through every day of testimony, refusing to look away. When asked later what kept her there, she said, "I needed them to see what they took from us." The jury took less than 5 hours to reach a verdict. Both were found guilty of murder. In February 2024, the judge sentenced Scarlett Jenkinson to life with a minimum term of 22 years, and Eddie Ratcliffe to life with a minimum of 20. They were among the youngest defendants in British history to receive such sentences for this type of offence. But for the public, the deep concern wasn't just the act itself, it was the motive, or apparent lack of one. Psychologists describe the pair as fascinated by violence and detached from empathy. Scarlett had a collection of true crime notes and horror material. Eddie had kept a digital diary about wanting to commit a fatal act. Together, they created a feedback loop, each validating the other's disturbing thoughts until fantasy became action. In 2025, Ghey founded a campaign for stricter regulation of online spaces, fighting to make sure no other family endures what hers did. Her advocacy turned grief into change, making Brianna's name not just a memory, but a mission. When a fatal act is meticulously planned and documented not out of passion or grievance, but as a shared project to fulfill a dark fantasy, how can a society identify and intervene in the spaces where reality and violent ideation merge? It started online in chat rooms, messages, and teenage games of trust. 2 boys, 1 girl, and a friendship that blurred into something darker. By the time anyone realized what was happening, it was already too late. In March 2010, in Langford, British Columbia, 8-year-old Kimberly Proctor was finishing her last year of high school. She was bright, sarcastic, and creative, the kind of teenager who stood out without trying. Friends called her funny, confident, and impossible to ignore. She loved computers, anime, and writing stories that mixed humor with heartbreak. Online, she could be her full self, unfiltered, open, alive. That's where she met Cruz Wellwood and Cameron Moffat, two classmates who seemed awkward but harmless. They hung out in group chats, played games, and joked about school. Kimberly treated them as friends, but behind their screens, the two boys were becoming something else entirely. Both boys lived in relative isolation. Cruz, 16, was intelligent but reportedly disturbed. His father was a convicted individual, and his home life was fractured. He spent nights reading about violence and power, fascinated by individuals who reportedly felt nothing. Cameron, 17, was quieter but equally detached, eager to impress the only person who paid attention to him. Together, they formed a closed loop where empathy seemed to evaporate and fantasy took over. This raises a persistent question. To what extent can a person's environment and social isolation shape their capacity for empathy? Before we analyze the suspicions in the case, please let me know where you saw this video. I will read it all and spread it around the world. They had planned every detail, even which friend to lure and how to make her disappear. Chat logs later showed hundreds of messages describing the intended act. Step by step, they joked about it like it was a challenge, a story they were writing together. How does the barrier of a screen potentially desensitize individuals to the real-world consequences of their digital fantasies? The friend they chose was Kimberly. On the 18th of March 2010, Cruz messaged her to come over. She agreed without hesitation. She'd been to his house before. She trusted him. Before leaving, she texted a friend that she'd be right back. It was the last message she ever sent. The events that followed were methodical and profoundly tragic. The plan unfolded exactly as they had designed it. Inside the house, Kimberly was subjected to physical restraint. Forensic evidence later indicated she was also subjected to severe personal violation. The cause of death was determined to be asphyxiation, after which her remains were concealed in a freezer. Hours later, they transported the remains in the bag along the Galloping Goose Trail and beneath a pedestrian bridge attempted to destroy the evidence using fire. Her parents called her phone until the voicemail filled, still hoping she'd pick up. By morning, police had found the bag, which contained burned fabric, ash, and human remains. Langford, a city known for safety and quiet streets, woke to a tragic reality. Investigators quickly traced Kimberly's last online messages and calls, leading them straight to Cruz and Cameron. When officers arrived, both individuals appeared calm, even curious. Inside Cruz's computer, detectives found everything: chat logs, violent fantasies, and digital blueprints of the event. One file was titled The Plan. It ended with a line that read, "We have to make it perfect." Faced with the evidence, both confessed. Their statements were described as emotionless, mere lists of actions without apparent remorse. One detective later said, "It was like listening to a tutorial." In court, prosecutors read their online conversations aloud. The courtroom fell silent as jurors listened to teenagers casually describe how to end a life. They talked about which excuses they'd use if caught, how they'd act normal afterward, and how they'd laugh about it later. There was no clear motive, no apparent anger, no jealousy. They didn't seem to want revenge. They seemingly wanted the experience. Psychologists later identified this as a form of sadism, potentially born from boredom. The judge called it evil for entertainment. Both were charged as adults with first-degree murder. In 2011, they were sentenced to life in prison with no chance of parole for 10 years. The maximum penalty allowed under Canada's youth sentencing laws at the time. The judge told them, "You are cold-blooded, calculated, and without empathy." For Kimberly's family, justice felt hollow. Her father, Fred Proctor, stood outside the courthouse and said, "They took everything from her, and they did it because they could." He refused to use their names in interviews, saying they didn't deserve to be remembered. Over time, the case became a landmark in digital criminology, Canada's first fully documented online-to-offline murder. Every message, every plan, every fantasy had been typed, stored, and recovered. Even years later, Psychologists studying the case pointed to the absence of a traditional motive, calling it a blueprint for how empathy can disappear in isolation. As of 2025, Cruz Wellwood and Cameron Moffat remain in prison. Both have applied for parole and been denied, with panels citing a lack of genuine remorse. In the end, Kimberly Proctor's case wasn't about hate. It was about emptiness. Two teenagers turned friendship into fantasy, and fantasy into a devastating reality. In an age where every keystroke can be a confession, what does it tell us about human nature when the only motive for a devastating act is simply the experience itself? In 2011, in the small town of Summerfield, Florida, a 17-year-old was lured to a house by his ex-girlfriend, and his life was ended by the same people he once called his friends. It was a story of teenage jealousy, manipulation, and group dynamics, one that played out not in silence, but through texts, Facebook messages, and misplaced bravado. Seath Jackson was 17, described as charming, athletic, and loud. He loved dirt bikes, loud music, and making people laugh. Friends said he had a good heart, but, like many teens, he got caught up in drama. He was dating Amber Wright, a 15-year-old with a sharp tongue and a rebellious streak. Their relationship was reportedly intense, characterized by periods of affection, fighting, breaking up, and reconciling, all documented on Facebook. By the spring of 2011, it had turned toxic. Seath accused Amber of being unfaithful. She accused him of being abusive. Their arguments became public posts, shared and commented on by classmates. This raises a critical question about modern relationships. At what point does publicly airing private conflict on social media cross a line from teenage drama to a public catalyst for real-world hostility? What looked like typical teenage heartbreak was about to turn into something much darker. Amber had started seeing another boy, 8-year-old Michael Bargo, who was described as intense and possessive. Bargo developed a strong animosity towards Seath, viewing him as competition and an obstacle that needed to be removed. What began as jealousy escalated into a fixation. He reportedly told his friends that Seath needed to die. Most people who heard this brushed it off as empty talk or teenage posturing. But Bargo was not joking. He began to formulate a plan, and that plan revolved around one thing: luring Seath into a trap. On the 17th of April 2011, Amber messaged Seath on Facebook, telling him she wanted to make peace. She said she missed him and that she wanted to talk. Her words were calm, even sweet. Seath believed her. He told his friend he was going to see Amber that night. That was the last time anyone saw him alive. Amber and her friend, 8-year-old Charlie Ely, were waiting at Ely's house, a small property at the edge of town. Inside were Bargo, his friend Kyle Hooper, and Justin Soto. The house reportedly smelled of cigarettes and gasoline. They had already acquired a firearm and rehearsed what they were going to do. When Seath walked in, he was ambushed. The attack was immediate. Bargo discharged the firearm multiple times, while the others reportedly joined in, striking and restraining him. In the ensuing chaos, Seath attempted to flee, but there was nowhere to go. Within minutes, he had succumbed to his injuries, but what followed was even more disturbing. The group placed his remains into a sleeping bag, carried it outside, and attempted to incinerate it in a backyard fire pit. When the flames died down, they gathered the remaining evidence, placed it in paint buckets, and then submerged it in a nearby limestone quarry. Then, as if nothing had happened, they went out for food. When Seath didn't come home, his parents reported him missing. Police began checking his friends' stories, and within 24 hours, their accounts unraveled. Text messages between Amber, Bargo, and others revealed every step of the plan. One message from Amber read, "We're going to fix this tonight." Another from Bargo simply said, "Bring him here." Detectives descended on the Ely house. Inside, they found evidence of the altercation, including projectile holes, biological matter, and ash in the fire pit. The group was arrested within days. One by one, they confessed, some with apparent guilt, some without emotion. The trial gripped Florida, Prosecutors described it as a teenage conspiracy fueled by jealousy. Every detail came from the responsible parties themselves: the messages, the setup, and the final act. Bargo was portrayed as the ringleader, manipulative, dominant, and obsessed with revenge. Amber was the bait. Charlie Ely provided the house. Hooper and Soto helped carry it out. When Bargo took the stand, he showed no remorse, stating that Seath deserved what happened. The jury didn't hesitate. He was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death, becoming the youngest person on Florida's death row at the time. The others received life sentences. Amber Wright, just 15 when the incident occurred, was sentenced to life without parole. After appeals citing her age, her sentence was later reduced. Charlie Ely's conviction was later vacated and refiled as a lesser charge, leading to her early release in 2021. For Seath's family, those sentences meant little. His father, Scott Jackson, said he couldn't forgive the people who had smiled at his son one week and taken his life the next. They used friendship as a weapon, he said. The case became a signal of how teenage emotion, when combined with social media and peer influence, can spiral into a tragic outcome. Even years later, investigators say it remains one of the most disturbing cases they've ever seen, not just for the nature of the act, but for its coordination. 6 teenagers, each playing a role, each seemingly convinced they were part of something justified. As of 2025, Michael Bargo remains on death row, his appeals slowly winding through the courts. The others live with the weight of what they did, some free, some still serving time. But the memory of that night still hangs over Summerfield like a shadow that never lifted. When a plan for violence is so openly discussed and documented through digital communication, where does the responsibility of a social circle lie for recognizing and intervening before threatening words become irreversible actions? In 1985, in the quiet foothills of Los Angeles County, a teenage girl went missing. She wasn't taken by a stranger or an opportunistic individual. She was reportedly lured out by her 2 best friends, and she never came home. Michelle "Missy" Avila was 17, a bright, warm-hearted girl who loved fashion, dancing, and spending time with friends. She grew up in Arleta, California, part of a tight-knit family that adored her. Her friends described her as bubbly, loyal, and kind, the kind of girl who drew attention without trying to. In retrospect, some wondered if this was the root of the problem. Her closest friends, Karen Severson and Laura Doyle, had known her since childhood. They were inseparable, engaging in sleepovers, sharing gossip, taking photos, seemingly everything a teenage friendship should be. But by high school, cracks began to form. Missy had started dating, making new friends, and spending less time with them. Rumors began to spread, unsubstantiated claims about her flirting with other girls' boyfriends, about her changing. It was unclear who started them, but they took hold. Behind these rumors, it was later alleged, was jealousy. Karen and Laura reportedly felt left behind. It suggested they didn't just envy Missy's appearance. They envied her perceived confidence, an ease she carried that they felt they could not imitate. On the 1st of October 1985, Laura called Missy and invited her out. She said Karen wanted to talk, to clear the air about the tension that had grown between them. Missy agreed. She told her mother she was going to hang out for a bit and would be home by dinner. She never returned. The 3 girls drove out to the mountains near Big Tuyunga Canyon, a wooded area about an hour from home. At first, it was just awkward small talk. Then, the argument began. Karen accused Missy of stealing her boyfriend. Laura joined in. Missy, described as confused and hurt, denied everything. But the confrontation escalated dramatically. The girls reportedly overpowered her, moved her toward a creek bed, and inflicted severe injuries. The cause of death was determined to be asphyxiation by water. Further evidence indicated she was subjected to additional harm, and a heavy log was placed over her remains. The other 2 then ran back to the car and drove away, as if nothing had happened. When Missy didn't come home that night, her family panicked. They called friends, police, anyone who might have seen her. 3 days later, hikers discovered her remains in the creek. The scene stunned investigators, not just because of the nature of the discovery, but because of the victim's profile. A teenage girl left in the wilderness. It was clear this was not a random act. She had likely been with people she trusted. At first, no one suspected Karen or Laura. They were visibly upset at the funeral, hugged Missy's mother, and even participated in the search efforts. In a remarkable turn of events, Karen moved in with Missy's family for a time, claiming she wanted to help them through their grief. She reportedly slept in Missy's bed, wore her clothes, and comforted her mother, all while concealing her involvement in the incident. This level of deception is difficult for many to comprehend. What psychological mechanisms allow a person to maintain such a facade in the face of profound grief they themselves caused? Years passed. Rumors swirled within the community, but there was no solid proof to proceed. Then, nearly 6 years later in 1991, the truth finally surfaced. A mutual friend came forward after a personal dispute with Karen, informing police that both girls had privately confessed to the act, allegedly even bragging about what they had done. Investigators reopened the case, and the details emerged quickly. Both Karen Severson and Laura Doyle were arrested and charged with second-degree murder. Their trials captivated California. Prosecutors painted them as jealous friends driven by envy. The defense, in contrast, argued they were immature, reckless, and had never intended for the confrontation to become fatal. The jury, however, was not convinced by this argument. Both were found guilty. In 1992, they were sentenced to 15 years to life in prison. For Missy's mother, Avila, it was a form of justice, but not closure. The fact that Karen had lived in her home, offered comfort, and pretended to share her grief represented a betrayal that, for her, ran deeper than the act itself. After serving over 2 decades, both women were eventually paroled, Karen in 2011 and Laura in 2012. But their release did not bring peace. Karen began promoting a book she wrote about the case, calling it her side of the story. Missy's family was outraged. Avila led a public campaign to prevent convicted individuals from profiting from their crimes. In 2013, California passed Missy's Law, which blocks individuals convicted of serious crimes from earning money through books, films, or interviews related to their offenses. It was Irene's way of ensuring her daughter's name would be associated with positive change rather than just tragedy. The story of Missy Avila became one of the most prominent cases of its kind in America. It wasn't just the details of the crime that captured public attention, but the profound sense of betrayal. The image of her friends expressing grief at her funeral while knowing their own involvement haunted everyone who heard it. It's the kind of story that forces a re-examination of adolescent relationships, social dynamics, and the very nature of trust. When trust is so completely shattered by the very people who were meant to be the closest, how does a family or a community even begin to rebuild? It was supposed to be another night of teenage rebellion music, laughter, and smoke in the dark. But by sunrise, one of them was gone. In 1995, Arroyo Grande, California, looked like every small coastal town in America. Eucalyptus trees swayed in the wind, the surf hummed in the distance, and a calm that made tragedy seem impossible. One 6-year-old Elise Marie Parlor grew up there, surrounded by the ordinary comforts of a close family. She was artistic, loved the drama club, and filled sketchbooks with drawings of places she hoped to visit one day. Teachers remembered her as bright, funny, and gentle, the kind of girl who turned awkward silences into laughter. Her parents said she trusted easily, perhaps too easily. That summer, Elise crossed paths with 3 local teens, Jacob Delasmut, Joseph Fiorella, and Royce Casey. They were perceived as misfits, known for their black clothes, long hair, and notebooks covered in band logos. They spent afternoons in garages, listening to heavy metal and talking about forming a band called Hatred. It was a familiar form of teenage rebellion until fantasy began to replace reality. Fiorella, only 15 but reportedly manipulative, became fixated on the idea that power and transgression were linked. He read about fringe rituals, quoted lyrics from the band Slayer, and began telling the others that a virgin sacrifice could give their group fame. At first, it may have sounded like a dark joke, but slowly his fascination turned serious. Delismote and Cassie followed his lead, perhaps searching for an identity or afraid to appear weak. What causes a group dynamic to shift from shared interest to shared delusion? Elise knew them in passing, through mutual friends and music. They weren't strangers, and she had no reason to fear them. So when they invited her to hang out in the eucalyptus grove outside town on the 22nd of July 1995, she said yes. It was a summer night, warm and quiet, the kind that felt safe. They met after dark. The grove overlooked the ocean, and the air smelled like salt and dust. The four teenagers stood in a loose circle, passing a joint and joking about music and their imaginary band. Then, the laughter stopped. Fiorella allegedly gave a signal. The other two hesitated and then followed. The attack that followed was fast, severe, and chaotic. Elise screamed, but the sound of the ocean reportedly masked her voice. When it was over, she lay still. The three boys stood over her, breathing hard, staring at what they had done. There was no ritual, no candles, no perceived power, only silence. They left her there and walked home in the dark. For 8 months, Elise's disappearance haunted the city. In a deeply disturbing development, the individuals reportedly returned to the grove on multiple occasions and interfered with her remains. Her parents filed missing person reports, printed posters, and begged for help on local news. Volunteers searched fields and riverbanks. Her friends refused to believe she'd run away. Her mother, Leanne Parlor, told reporters she still set a place for Elle at dinner every night, hoping her daughter might somehow come back. But the phone never rang. The case went cold. Then, in March 1996, one of the responsible parties broke his silence. Royce Casey, the oldest, had started attending church. The sermons reportedly weighed on him, and he couldn't sleep. One afternoon, he walked into a police station and told them everything. He confessed that Fiorella had convinced them that taking Elle's life would grant their band demonic power. He described how they had lured her out, how they had planned it for weeks, and how they had even talked about doing it again. Detectives followed him to the grove. Beneath the dry brush and fallen leaves, they found human remains. It was Elise's body, exactly where he said it would be. The town was shattered. Overnight, national media descended, labeling the case a satanic murder. The headlines practically wrote themselves. 3 metal-obsessed teens, a quiet California girl, and whispers of ritual sacrifice. The satanic panic of the 1,980 seconds had never truly died, and this case poured fuel back onto it. Parents everywhere were terrified of the music their kids were listening to. How much responsibility does sensationalized media coverage bear for shaping public perception, potentially steering the narrative away from the more tangible, human elements of the case? Inside the courtroom, the truth was presented as more devastating and far less mystical. There were no rituals, no demons, just ego, fantasy, and the profound blindness of youth. The prosecution's view was that the boys weren't possessed by an external evil. They were corrupted by each other. Prosecutors laid out their planning in chilling detail, referencing journal entries, lyrics they had copied, and conversations about how a sacrifice would make their band famous. All 3 confessed. None could fully explain why. In 1997, each pleaded guilty to first-degree murder to avoid the death penalty. They were sentenced to 25 years to life. Fiorella mumbled an apology. Her father, Terry Parlor, said quietly, "They took every tomorrow she was supposed to have." But even prison didn't end the headlines. In 2000, Elise's family filed a civil lawsuit against Slayer, arguing that the band's lyrics glorified violence and had influenced the individuals responsible. It became a global story, sparking a debate about art, responsibility, and morality. The courts ultimately dismissed the case, ruling that music could not be legally blamed for the actions. The responsibility, they said, rested solely with the three who had chosen to act. Life in Arroyo Grande moved on, but the story never really vanished. Then, almost 30 years later, it returned to the headlines. In 2025, Royce Casey and Jacob Delish were both granted parole. They told the board they had found faith, that they had grown up, and that they were no longer the boys they once were. The decision sparked outrage. Elise's mother spoke again to reporters, saying, "Forgiveness might one day be possible, but freedom was not the same as justice." Joseph Fiorella remains in prison, serving his life term. The story of Elisa Parlor became a mirror, reflecting an uncomfortable truth. Profound harm doesn't always arrive with complex symbols and rituals. Sometimes it looks like three bored teenagers chasing a fantasy they didn't understand. When a crime is committed by minors, driven by a disturbing, shared fantasy, how does society balance the permanent, irreversible nature of their act against the human capacity for change and rehabilitation over a lifetime? In 2012, in Star City, West Virginia, one 6-year-old Skylar Neese snuck out of her bedroom window one warm July night to meet her two best friends. By morning, she was gone. For months, no one could understand what happened until the truth emerged. The individuals she trusted most had reportedly planned the incident for weeks. Skylar was an only child, bright and ambitious. She had straight A's, a part-time job at Wendy's, and dreams of becoming a lawyer. Her parents described her as independent but caring, the kind of daughter who would argue, roll her eyes, and then hug you before bed. She spent nearly all her free time with Sheila Eddy and Rachel Schoaf, her best friends since freshman year. To anyone looking in, they were inseparable. 3 girls posting photos, going to parties, sharing everything. But behind those smiles, the friendship had soured. By the summer of 2012, Skylar had begun distancing herself. She confided in her diary that she found Sheila to be manipulative, that Rachel followed her lead, and that she was tired of their constant drama. She wrote one line that would later haunt investigators: "They're not really my friends." This raises a question. In an era dominated by social media, how do we differentiate between typical adolescent conflict and genuine warning signs? On the night of July 5, Skylar climbed out of her window, careful not to wake her parents. A surveillance camera caught her running toward a waiting car, Sheila's silver sedan. They told her they were going for a drive, just like old times. Skylar climbed in, smiling. It would be her last ride. The three drove around for a while, laughing and playing music. Eventually, they crossed into rural Pennsylvania, parking near a wooded area they had visited before. It was dark and quiet, the kind of silence that makes even whispers sound heavy. When they got out, Skylar likely thought they were just going to smoke and talk. Instead, on a signal, the girls initiated a planned attack, both having brought sharp implements. Reports indicate Skylar resisted, asking why this was happening. The alleged response was deeply disturbing. "We just didn't like you anymore." After she succumbed to the severe injuries, the two individuals moved her remains under some brush, concealed them with branches, and drove home before sunrise. They slept in their beds as if nothing had happened. The next morning, Skylar's parents found her bedroom empty. Her window was open, the stool she'd used to climb out still in place. They called police immediately, reporting her missing. At first, investigators assumed she was a runaway, but that theory fell apart fast. Skylar had left behind her phone charger, money, and all her personal items. Her friends, Sheila and Rachel, told detectives she had run off with someone else, a story they repeated over and over, even joining the search efforts. Sheila posted on social media constantly, projecting an image of grief. She tweeted, "Skylar, please come home." She hugged Skylar's mother in front of cameras. She even stood beside her at vigils. All the while, she knew exactly where Skylar was. This level of sustained public deception is a deeply unsettling aspect of the case. Months passed with no leads. Then, in December 2012, Rachel cracked. Overcome with guilt and fear, she broke down during a police interview and confessed. We did it, she said. She led investigators to the woods where Skylar's remains were located, concealed and exposed to the elements. The confession shocked the country. 2 teenage girls, both honor students seen smiling in selfies, had taken the life of their best friend for no apparent conventional reason. The motive appeared to be rooted in resentment and control. They just didn't want her around anymore. Both girls were charged as adults. Rachel pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and received a sentence of 30 years with the possibility of parole after 10. Sheila went to trial and was convicted of first-degree murder, sentenced to life in prison with parole eligibility after 15. In court, Skylar's father, Dave Neese, stared at Sheila as the verdict was read. He later said, "She looked at me like I was nothing, like she still didn't understand what she did." The case became national news, not just because of the individuals' ages, but because it shattered the illusion of what teenage friendship looks like. Social media had painted them as inseparable. Their photos still lingered online, smiling faces, inside jokes, and heartfelt captions. The contrast between those digital images and the reality of what occurred in the woods is difficult to comprehend. In 2013, West Virginia passed Skylar's Law, requiring Amber Alerts to be issued for all missing children, even if they're initially thought to be runaways. It was her parents' way of making sure no one else's child would vanish without immediate action. The tree line, where Skylar's life ended, still stands, quiet, ordinary, almost peaceful. Locals say that if you visit at night, you can hear the river moving nearby and the wind through the branches. It feels like a place that remembers. Some cases make headlines, but others, like Skylar Neese's, change the way we see trust itself. How can we navigate the profound gap between the curated friendships we see online and the complex, often hidden, realities of human relationships? In November 1997, in Victoria, British Columbia, 4-year-old Reena Virk left home to meet her friends near the Gorge Waterway. She told her family she'd be back soon. By morning, she had vanished. Within days, the truth would emerge. Reena hadn't just disappeared. She had been subjected to severe physical trauma, resulting in fatal injuries consistent with drowning, and left in the water by the same peers she desperately wanted to belong to. Reena was the daughter of Indian immigrants, raised in a Jehovah's Witness household. She was bright, curious, and sensitive, but she struggled to fit in. Her classmates reportedly teased her for looking different, for dressing differently, for not being like everyone else. She wanted, more than anything, to be accepted. In that search for belonging, she found a problematic crowd. By the fall of 1997, Reena had started hanging out with a group of teenagers, mostly girls, some older, some already in trouble with school or the law. They smoked, skipped classes, and projected a tough image. To Reena, they seemed confident and free. To them, she was a target, someone to mock, manipulate, and use. The reported ringleader was Kelly Ellard, 15, a popular girl with a sharp tongue and a reputation for being unkind. Alongside her was Warren Glowatsky, 16, who was quieter but easily influenced. Together, they became the center of the group's drama, which led to Reena's tragic outcome. On the night of November 14, Reena was invited to a gathering under the Craigflower Bridge, a common hangout for local teens. She thought it was her chance to finally fit in. She put on makeup, borrowed perfume, and walked out the door, smiling. When she arrived, the group of about 8 teenagers turned on her. Rumors had spread that Reena had been gossiping about them. The confrontation escalated fast. They surrounded her, shouting insults, pushing her, and pulling her hair. Witnesses later said it started like a school fight, but ended as something else entirely. She was subjected to a significant physical assault, including being dragged by her hair until she collapsed. Then, one by one, most of the group walked away, all except Kelly Ellard and Warren Glowatsky. Reena, injured and terrified, managed to get to her feet and start walking home along the dark waterway. Ellard and Glowatsky followed her. According to Warren's later testimony, Kelly pushed Reena back toward the water and continued the assault. Warren stated he tried to intervene but ultimately did not. When the altercation ended, Reena was left face down in the gorge waterway. The two individuals then left her there. Her parents reported her missing that night. Police initially treated it as a runaway case, a teenager upset after a fight. But when classmates began whispering about what really happened under the bridge, the investigation exploded. Within days, officers arrested several teens involved in the first assault. Then, weeks later, remains surfaced near the bridge. It was Reena. The discovery shook Canada. The idea that a group of teenagers, particularly girls, could be involved in such a severe act of violence felt incomprehensible to many. The public demanded answers. How could a dynamic among peers, so young, escalate to this fatal point? The trial revealed everything. Witnesses described the initial assault in graphic detail. Some of the attackers testified against Kelly and Warren, saying the group mentality made them feel unstoppable. The prosecution argued that Ellard was the final aggressor and was responsible for the actions that led to Reena's death, perhaps to silence her. Warren admitted he participated in restraining Reena, but insisted he hadn't realized the outcome would be fatal. In 1999, both were convicted of second-degree murder. Warren Glowatsky was sentenced to life with no parole for 7 years. Kelly Ellard's conviction was appealed and retried multiple times, but each jury came to the same conclusion. She was guilty. For Reena's parents, Manjit and Suman Virk, justice felt incomplete. They spoke publicly about forgiveness, not out of peace, but out of exhaustion. "We can't hate children," Manjit said, "but we can't understand them either." This reflects the profound cognitive dissonance experienced by a community trying to reconcile the perpetrator's youth with the severity of the act. The case permanently changed Canada's conversation about bullying. It forced schools, parents, and lawmakers to face a truth no one wanted to see: that cruelty among teenagers wasn't just emotional, it could escalate to a fatal outcome. Warren Glowatsky, long paroled, continued to speak publicly about guilt and accountability, working with at-risk youth. Kelly Ellard, now known by her legal name, Carrie Sim, had her day parole revoked after violating conditions. Her perceived lack of remorse remained a point of public discussion, but the legacy that matters most belongs to Reena herself. Her story became a turning point for anti-bullying education in Canada, a reminder that exclusion and verbal harassment can escalate into something irreversible. When the psychological pressure to conform to a group overrides an individual's moral compass, where does the responsibility of the bystander end and the culpability of the participant begin? It began with tears, laughter, and a MySpace photo. By nightfall, one of them would no longer be alive. In 2005, before the era of Instagram and Snapchat, MySpace was the epicenter of teenage life. It served as the first prominent digital stage where friendship became a form of public performance. Every selfie was a statement, and every top 8 was a declaration of loyalty. For one 6-year-old Adrienne Reynolds, it represented a fresh start. Having recently moved from Texas to East Moline, Illinois, she was hoping to fit in, make friends, and find a sense of belonging. She seemed to find what she was looking for in Sarah Kolb and Corey Gregory. Sarah was the dominant personality, sharp, magnetic, and widely regarded with a sense of apprehension. Corey was her shadow, a quiet individual who appeared to follow her lead without question. Together, they were an inseparable and influential duo, with others in their social circle orbiting around them. When Adrienne joined their group, the trio presented a picture-perfect image in the school hallways, in photographs, and especially online. But beneath the polished surface, a significant conflict was developing. Adrienne's humor and confidence began to draw attention, and Sarah was reportedly uncomfortable sharing the spotlight. This jealousy appears to have intensified over time, becoming a point of fixation. Corey found himself in the middle of this growing friction. a follower caught in a difficult position. Friends started to notice the underlying tension, observing subtle remarks and cold glances exchanged between the girls. On Friday, the 21st of January, 2005, the group decided to leave school for lunch. They met at a local Taco Bell, where they were seen laughing and taking photos. Afterward, Sarah suggested they go for a drive. They left the town limits, heading toward the quiet, wooded area of Black Hawk State Historic Site. Adrian was in the back seat, unaware of the events that were about to unfold. When the vehicle stopped, an argument erupted. Sarah accused Adrian of being disingenuous and of attempting to undermine her position within their social group, particularly regarding Corey. Adrian tried to de-escalate the situation, but Sarah's anger escalated quickly. Before we analyze the suspicions in the case, please let me know where you saw this video. I will read it all and spread it around the world. A physical altercation ensued. According to Corey's later testimony, Sarah called for his assistance, and he complied. The two of them were responsible for inflicting fatal injuries upon Adrian. Afterward, Corey reportedly stood by while Sarah lit a cigarette, showing little emotional reaction. In that moment, the perception of her as a formidable individual was cemented. They then placed Adrian's remains in the back of the car and drove away. There was no apparent plan, only a shared and stunned silence. Back at the garage of Corey's grandparents, they concealed the evidence for 2 full days. During this time, they engaged in normal activities like watching television and updating their MySpace profiles, acting as though nothing had occurred. By Sunday, however, the reality of their situation became unavoidable. They contacted another classmate, 6-year-old Nathan Gaudette, and asked for his help. The 3 of them then drove to a remote field outside of town. There, they attempted to destroy the evidence using gasoline. When this method failed to achieve its purpose, they took further steps to conceal the remains, ultimately placing them in a manhole at Black Hawk State Historic Site. In a chilling coincidence, Adrian's last post on her MySpace page read, "Hanging with Sarah later." That post was never taken down. Days later, highway workers discovered burned material in the field. DNA analysis soon confirmed what the community had begun to fear. Adrian Reynolds was gone. When police brought the pair in for questioning, Corey was the first to provide a statement. His confession emerged in fragments, a mixture of fear, obedience, and regret. This raises a critical question about culpability. How do we distinguish between a willing accomplice and an individual acting under extreme coercion? Sarah, in contrast, remained calm and confident, altering her account of events with each interview. One detective noted that she carried herself as if she were the most intelligent person in the room. The subsequent trials became a media spectacle, dubbed the MySpace murder. Prosecutors portrayed Sarah as a manipulative individual, driven by a need for control. Corey was presented as her subordinate, a willing accessory whose loyalty was misplaced. Witnesses testified that Sarah had previously bragged about being untouchable. The jury reached its verdict swiftly. Sarah Kolb was convicted of first-degree murder and concealment of a homicide, receiving a sentence of 48 years. Corey Gregory was sentenced to 45 years. Nathan Gaudette served 5 years in a juvenile facility for his role in attempting to destroy evidence. For the small town of East Moline, the case left a lasting wound. Students who once shared classes with the 3 of them were now attending grief counseling sessions. Adrian's stepfather remarked that he kept expecting her to walk through the front door, a hope that persisted until he saw her name in the headlines. Her MySpace page transformed from a social profile into a memorial, flooded with messages from friends expressing their regret for not recognizing the warning signs. As the years passed, both of the responsible parties attempted to reframe their narratives. Sarah earned educational certificates in prison and claimed to have found religion. Corey wrote letters expressing a desire for redemption. Both would eventually have their cases revisited in court, but the outcomes of their retrials remained unchanged. No explanation, however, could alter the events that transpired in those woods and over the 2 days that followed. The horror of Adrian Reynolds' death lies not just in the act itself, but in the apparent void behind it. There was no financial motive, no long-standing feud, just the destructive forces of jealousy, pride, and the illusion of power fostered by a digital screen. When a tragedy is driven not by tangible motives but by perceived social slights amplified through a screen, how does a community begin to heal from a wound it can't fully comprehend?